Hi, I'm Jennifer Hobson Plattner, and we're here to talk about Chapter 16 in our U.S. History class, Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. So we are going to talk about plans of putting a very war-torn nation back together today. Let me go ahead and pull out the PowerPoint. Oops, and there we will begin. Chapter 16. The process of reconstructing the nation after 4 years of civil war was a long and exhausting process. So long, in fact, that it may have even allowed the South to lose the war, but to win the peace. What do you think? Reconstruction had some significant achievements, but was ultimately a failure. Rating that from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The freedmen and freedwomen. After the Civil War, Black Americans encountered a new world of opportunity. First, we need to talk about that nearly 23% of the South's fighting age men had died in the war, which is a huge chunk of just terrible loss. And there were some jobs that needed to be done. Number one, the political question about how to integrate the rebel states back into the nation. You have the Senate and the Congress had no Southern representatives because they had rebelled, and how to have them come back and not be to be civil and to work on the government again. And the second question that really needed to be tackled was, how do you integrate 4 million newly freed slaves? 4 million. Not an easy question at all. You also can see that the market revolution is shifting into the industrial revolution during this time. And there's a wonderful thought. I believe it's a quote I once heard a professor say previously when I was in grad school. You can free the slave, but you still have the slave owner. And that's kind of the mentality of the South. The slaves are free, but you still have that person who wanted to continue to control, own a human being, and oppress. So it was really a difficult situation. The slaves are newly freed, the free men and free women, and they have, after the passage of the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, they have a whole new world. What does it mean to be free after you've been a slave for so long? Many of them, it meant mobility, that they could move about the country and find their long lost family members because mothers and children were separated, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, just families reuniting if they could find them. They didn't have the internet or Google. It was not easy to find them. Some probably were easier than others, but this was a whole new opportunity to reunite the families. They had more control over their own lives. They had autonomy, which is the freedom to choose for themselves, or agency to make choices on your own, where they'd never had it before. They also expanded into they made a lot of Black churches. That was one thing that they did, their religious independence and that choice, that they built many Black churches. Some of them even just to buy a dog was just a benefit of being free that they had never had before. You have to understand, before they were seen as property, as chattel. They were not permitted to read according to many slave codes, or even to participate in church unless their master said it was okay. The old hierarchy was gone, but it was still waiting in the shadows to once again oppress and put people under them and subordinate them. Right. The Freedmen's Bureau. Congress designed the Freedmen's Bureau. They managed schools and built them, provided food and medical care to the needy Southern Blacks and whites, ensure access to the judicial system for the Southerners. it was not popular to be a Republican Southerner. In fact, you'll see at the end of the chapter that a lot of violence came out of it. The Ku Klux Klan actually was founded in 1865 by 6 white Confederate soldiers. There were some other groups like this that were trying to put back in place the old hierarchy and not allow Black freedom to change their society. There needed to be social change, and they were really fighting against that. Some of the other groups were called, let's see, Southern Cross and the Knights of the White Camellia were also 2 other groups that were like the Ku Klux Klan. Okay. Now we need to talk about Lincoln's assassination and just how devastating. We have some pictures first. All right, some families reunited and making choices to be together. And then you have the Freedmen's Bureau, where people were being given supplies and on this new start in freedom. Okay. Political plans for Reconstruction. Before the war was over, President Lincoln had already pondered what it would take to bring the South back into the Union. This was a very delicate situation. And a lot of historians truly believe that with Lincoln's death, Reconstruction really failed because he was the one who could pull it off and pull it together. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction and his assassination. His assassination is something that is very fascinating as I dug deeper into it this week. First of all, it was a kidnapping that was gone wrong. He was supposed to be kidnapped by, I believe it was 6 assailants, and he was not at the rendezvous point where they thought he was going to be. So they went to Ford's Theater while he was watching the play, Our American Cousin, and of course John Wilkes Booth shot him there. 2 other people were actually supposed to be assassinated that very same day. The Vice President, Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat from the South, and that was Lincoln trying to put together a team to help the nation or keep them from going to civil war, or to put the nation together when Reconstruction happened. The person who was supposed to shoot Andrew Johnson decided to go to the bar and get drunk instead of assassinating him. So he got cold feet, and he still was arrested and prosecuted, but he did not follow through on his end of the deal. The Secretary of State, William H. Seward, just got into a carriage accident, went home to bed, and the perpetrator came through the window, tried to shoot him. The gun misfired, and then he was stabbed several times. He did recover, and he did not die. But the assailant in this case stabbed several people within his house, including his sister, some friends that were at the house at the time. This happened on April the 14th, 1865. When they were looking for John Wilkes Booth after he ran out of the theater, it was one of the largest manhunts in history. 10,000 federal troops, detectives, and police were tracking John Wilkes Booth, trying to find the assassin. So that is just amazing that it was just really the manpower and behind that was amazing. Now, when the conspirators were brought to trial and prosecuted, Mary Surratt was the first woman that was ever hung by the federal government for her crimes, the first woman. And she was the owner of the boarding house where they met to concoct their plan. So that is some amazing history. All right, so Lincoln had the 10% plan, which he really just wanted to not continue the punishment or the fighting. The country had lost so much with the Civil War. This was his plan before he died in 1863 that offered amnesty to any Southerner who proclaimed loyalty to support the Union of the emancipation of the slaves. Once 10% of a state's voters, only 10%, in the election of 1860, if they signed the oath, it could create a new state government, re-enter the Union, and they could have representation within Congress and the Senate. A lot of people did not like that. The Wade Davis bill was one who wanted 50%. The Ironclad Oath was even more. They wanted to really make sure that there wasn't going to be any more rebellion. It just was very sad because there was a lot of punishment on both sides, back and forth, and not a sense of reconciliation that really needed to take place. It is very interesting, this picture. I remember on my senior trip, I got to go to Washington, D.C. It was fascinating. I need to return. But standing in the Ford's Theater, you see all these red velvety seats, and you see where President Lincoln was actually shot. And you see the seat he was shot in actually is covered with plastic, as it is very historic, obviously. Very interesting. Andrew Johnson became the president. He was the vice president. Talk about the black codes. The black codes are just another way to have slavery resurfaced by another name. In fact, there's a great book. It's called Slavery by Another Name, and it is by Douglas A. Blackman. He is from the South, and he actually wrote this book. He's actually a journalist, which usually a historian does not endorse a journalist book, but he really is one that writes in a historian's style, where it's more objective. It's not for sensationalism or to just sell books. And he did his research and his footnotes as a historian would as well. So he talks about going into the police records and actually finding how the black codes really affected the South, and how he would actually find in these records a worker, someone who owns a business in a factory would say, we need 20 workers. So back then you could take people from the jail and get them to work. But what was happening is the police would go into the city, and if you were black, one of the black codes in many southern cities was if you were standing around without a job or with a job, and you didn't have a note from your employer with you, you could be rounded up and arrested. And then the policeman or the sheriff at that time would deliver you to these factory workers. And they saw this connection where, there might be several weekends where no one was arrested, and then all of a sudden 20 matched the 20 for the request. And so it was slavery by another name, and you were put in shackles and that sort of thing. So this is a really fascinating book talking about the abuses there. The black codes were just laws upon laws upon laws that just kept blacks from voting, for participating, and they got worse and worse as the federal troops were removed from the South. Okay, black codes are post-Civil War laws specifically written to govern the behavior of African Americans, modeled on the slave codes that existed before the Civil War. Okay, this is President Lincoln and Johnson, and how Johnson could not hold the country together. Okay, we have the Radical Republicans versus Johnson in the 14th Amendment, just trying to bring equality, regardless of race, was not really working. Okay, and there's a lot of frustrations. Okay, Reconstruction in the South. By 1868, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Arkansas, and Louisiana had representatives readmitted and senators from the 6 states because they had enough people swear allegiance to the Union. Let me remind you about the 14th Amendment. Amendment to the U.S. Constitution passed in 1868 that extended the guarantees of the Constitution and Bill of Rights to all persons born in the United States, including African Americans and former slaves. It promised that all citizens would receive the due process of law before any of their constitutional rights were breached.